Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. And I appreciate having Jonathan Granoff and Rorry Daniels here. And welcome from New York City, where I am sitting, as well as Rorry. And Jonathan is tuning in from New Jersey. So my name is Audrey Kitagawa, and I will be your moderator tonight to this Chinatown Hall, where we will explore pathways to peace in the U.S.-China relationship and how we can prevent the downward spiral into catastrophic conflict. In the face of recently accelerating language of aggression, which created international concern about the increased potential for conflict between the U.S. and China, this conversation tonight is an expression of the urgent need for cooperation and dialogue among the two world leaders, which we did see in the recent summit in Bali, as well as the citizens of our respective countries. We, of course, are members of civil society who comprise that vast body politique and citizenry of these two countries. And the voice of civil society is a growing voice, and we look for ways to mirror the cooperative engagement which we wish for our political leaders to have. And of course, this people-to-people connection, as John Huntsman just talked about, is very important to have. Now, according to the UN, the world's population has now reached 8 billion people. So we have growing complexity with the growing numbers of people inhabiting the one Earth with increasingly degrading environment. So on Monday, this week, Presidents Biden and Xi met in Bali. And Biden gave a very positive message when he said, as the leaders of our two nations, we share a responsibility to show that China and the United States can manage our differences, prevent competition from becoming anything ever near conflict, and to find ways to work together on urgent global issues that require our mutual cooperation. And he said that he's ready to work with China to address global challenges from climate to food insecurity. And President Xi, in his opening remarks on Monday, said that lessons can be learned from the U.S. and China's over 50-year relationship. She said history is the best textbook, so we should take history as a mirror and let it guide the future. And currently, the China-U.S. relationship is in such a situation that we all care a lot about it, because this is not the fundamental interests of our two countries and peoples, and it is not what the international community expects from us. He also said that as statesmen should think about and know how to get along with other countries and the wider world. He further said that the world is watching and expects the U.S. and China to properly handle the relationship. Now, the leaders discuss efforts to maintain and deepen lines of communication between the U.S. and China, responsibly manage competition, and work together where their interests align, especially on transnational challenges that affect the international community. And these two leaders also discussed a range of regional and global issues. And tonight, we are very privileged to have with us Mr. Jonathan Granoff, who's president of the GlobalSecurityInstitute. And you have read about him in the video that we played before the start of this program. So I will not go into further details and repeat what you've already read. But we very much appreciate one thing that was not on that video was the fact that he is receiving diplomatic status at the United Nations as a sitting representative of the International Anti-Corruption Academy, which has permanent observer status at the UN. So congratulations to you, Jonathan. And we're also very privileged to have Ms. Rorry Daniels, who is the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, or ASPI, where she leads and oversees strategies and operations for projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. And she also is fluent in Mandarin. So her most recent research project audited the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue to evaluate its process and outcomes. And she is also an experienced track 2 person. So I'm very interested in how she is engaged in that realm. So in the order of our program tonight, I would like to have each of our speakers first address their responses to the substantive aspects of the meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi. I also know that you each tuned into John Huntsman's town hall, which immediately preceded this town hall, where he also addressed the relationship between the U.S. and China. Now, as was indicated, John Huntsman was the former governor of Utah, a U.S. ambassador to China, Russia, and Singapore, and he served under 5 presidents. And Jonathan, I would like to begin with you first. Please share with us your response to what you heard of the meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi and John Huntsman's comments during his town hall.
Well, first, as to the meeting between the two heads of state, I thought the outcome was excellent. They didn't bite off more than they could chew in the time allotted, and they reaffirmed a process that they were both committed to improving our relations. That's consistent with what Ambassador Huntsman highlighted, that this is all about people to people, and it's all about process, and it's all about finding common interests. One of the interests that China has is not going down a spiral that could lead to a nuclear holocaust. They have a no first-use policy with nuclear weapons, for example. The size of their arsenal is minuscule compared to the size of Russia's and the United States. Now, Ambassador Huntsman highlighted many of the issues that President Biden highlighted, our common interests in protecting the planet, our common interest in improving relations and trade. Let me list some of the things that Ambassador Huntsman highlighted. 1, there will be pandemics again in the future, and we should be cooperating instead of putting national identity and national interest before the need to cooperate. It's interesting that during the height of the Cold War, behind the scenes, the Soviet Union and the United States encouraged scientists to cooperate in addressing the scourge of polio. The outcome of that has been the eradication of polio. Smallpox was the same thing. In the instance of the pandemic, in the United States, actually wearing masks became a politicized, toxic, adversarial relations emerged from that ignorance. Taking vaccines. Even the very existence of the virus was challenged at the beginning of its when it came out. He talked about the value of multiculturalism. Ambassador Huntsman did. He highlighted the culture of the Silicon Valley. In New York City, where our culture comes out of our plays, our writers, our musicians, etc. It's a completely unique phenomenon in human history of multiculturalism. That, Ambassador Huntsman highlighted, is one of the strengths of the United States. He emphasized how important it is not to demonize different races, different religions, and different people. His sensitivity to the scourge of racism was highlighted. He talked about the need for us to, in terms of weaponry, to establish strategic stability so that we're not going into a new arms race with China. And he highlighted the absolute danger of nuclear weapons. Even though the Chinese arsenal is less than 400, less than 200 of these weapons if they went off, would throw so much soot into the stratosphere, it would render modern civilization part of the dustbin of history. In sum, I thought that Ambassador Huntsman's advice was sage, measured, consistent, and I wish he was more prominent in the Republican Party. He's a Republican, and he's exactly the kind of leader who highlights reality over ideology. So I was quite pleased with his presentation, and I thought it was excellent. What comes out of that will be something we'll talk about later in this dialogue, I'm sure, which is the critique of how we've brought ourselves to a condition in which almost every issue that he addressed has become problematic. And the first thing you have to do to get out of a hole is to stop digging it. And I think that's what this meeting between the two heads of state affirmed. We're going to stop going the wrong direction. And I thought it was very hopeful. And I think the meeting with the G20 that directly followed reaffirmed that. In fact, the G20 went even further and said the threat or use of nuclear weapons is absolutely inadmissible. So hopefully the world is turning in a better direction than it's been the past several years.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Rorry, I wanted to acknowledge the article you wrote for the South China Morning Post on the meeting on Monday between President Xi and Biden. And in this opinion piece, you indicated that the U.S.-China relations remain fraught, but Xi and Biden are at least willing to work on them. And you synopsized two major points as follows. One, the U.S.-China talks in Bali gave both leaders a chance to voice their concerns without overshadowing the need for cooperation, which both acknowledge. And two, the real work of turning this goodwill into meaningful action now falls to the representatives of each side. And being a scholar on U.S.-China relations, please share your further responses to what you heard of the meeting between President Xi and Biden and from John Huntsman this evening at his town hall.
Well, thank you, Audrey, so much for having me, and thanks to the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation for putting this on. I'm really honored and delighted to be here to talk about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, which is how do we resolve differences between the U.S. and China peacefully and through dialogue rather than through confrontation and conflict. So I think that, as I outlined in the piece for South China Morning Post, I think the summit really was a good first step toward a productive dialogue. Not only did it stop digging the hole in bilateral relations, as Jonathan so aptly said, but it also, it started down the road toward a process by which the two sides can achieve what both sides have said is their preferred modus operandi, let's say, in international relations, which is that we know that we have a set of issues between the U.S. and China on which we are, our interests are not aligned, and we need to manage those issues responsibly. We have a set of issues on which we are competing very heavily between each other and in the international stage, and we need to have rules of the road in order to manage that competition responsibly. And then we have a set of issues on which we have substantive common interest. Jonathan pointed some of them out, and they include nuclear non-proliferation, global energy and food security, climate change and how to slow, stop, reverse its effects, as well as, general macroeconomic stability. So there should, in theory, be no reason that the US and China, the two largest economies in the world, two of the most powerful countries in the world, the two largest emitters as well, shouldn't have a common interest in trying to, successfully and productively address these challenges together. But the problem so far, from my perspective and understanding, has been that the issues that really divide us, the ones where we can't agree, whether that's, over Taiwan or over our respective political systems and the value and legitimacy of them, whether it's over human rights, those have really stopped our ability to be able to cooperate on issues of international and bilateral concern where our interests are aligned. So one thing that I took away from the summit was that it had almost a change of process in some ways in the US-China relationship and with these summits, where the initial leaders' statements were very clear about the need to manage the relationship responsibly, about the need not only to do that for bilateral reasons, but because the international community expects that of the US and China as two major powers with major responsibilities in the world system. And that allowed the two leaders to go into the meeting with a clear goal and a motivation behind their bilateral discussion. But the readouts after the meeting showed, I think, two their respective domestic audiences in a time when relations are fraught, that the two sides did not have to give an inch of areas where we disagree in order to achieve some sort of practical cooperation. But as you said, and as I noted in the piece, one aspect of John Huntsman's speech tonight that I really enjoyed is he said, diplomacy is a people's game. And that is so true. The Chinese system particularly is very tough on empowering people to play that game. So it was very important that Xi Jinping came out and said what he said about wanting to stabilize the US-China relationship and wanting to set a floor under it so that we don't devolve into conflict. But I'll be interested to see in the coming months what that means for actually empowering the people's game of all of the officials who are now going to meet. We already saw John Kerry and Chinese climate envoy Xie Jinhua talk on the sidelines of COP27. I find that incredible that there was so much pent up will in the system that almost the second the results of the bilateral meeting were out, that two major government officials could meet on a topic of global concern. But unfortunately, it did not seem as though that meeting produced any substantive results to start. So this process is just beginning, but I do have cautious optimism that it could prove to be a fruitful way forward.
Thank you so much, Rorry. And, of course, there are many issues which these two countries must deal with, which, as you indicated, does include the economics, food security, technology, global health, and Taiwan, just to name a few. And, there are two major issues that are of particular concern to many of our constituents who are tuning in tonight, which I would like you to address. And these two issues are the existential threats posed by nuclear weapons, which, have been, addressed, but I would like to have a deeper dive into it, and the climate change issue. And I note at this time that the G20 summit in Indonesia issued a 17-page unanimous statement condemning the war in Ukraine. And both President Xi and Biden gave clear messages in their bilateral meetings, as well as in this 17-page statement, of course, that nuclear weapons should not be used. And Jonathan, you have made it a point to create an overarching frame called human security to address the nuclear weapons issue and the climate change crisis. And first, I would like you to explain to us what you mean by human security and why your frame connects these two issues under human security. And secondly, Jonathan, I would like you to address China-US relations in the context of global threats and solutions. You now have the floor.
Thank you. Well, Audrey, I did not invent the term human security, nor highlight its importance. The highlighting of its importance was pursuant to a General Assembly resolution of the United Nations. The person who's credited with creating this concept is a fellow named Mahbub al-Haq, who was an economist in the United Nations Program for Development. And he, in 1994, he said we have to have a broader definition of security that's people-centered, that deals with the way people actually live, the security of their jobs, the security of their health, the security in their neighborhoods, the security that comes with having environmental security, the security of the rights of political expression, the security that is now threatened with a set of global threats that can't be met at the level of the nation state. When the nation state was created, the notion of national security based on borders and military capacity, that was in the 17th century. That was created, and people don't realize the state is a fairly modern invention. It was invented in 1648 in the treaties of Westphalia, designed to stop Protestants and Catholics from slaughtering each other in massive numbers in Central Europe. And that's basically the model that we have. And the motto of how we pursue security is not focusing on our common threats and our common challenges as a human community, but is mainly focused on military expenditures and military power based on a 5th century Roman maxim, prepare for war, receive peace, prepare for peace, receive war, which just simply equates with military prowess as security. And you can even see that military prowess, huge military prowess, can't even win wars in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc. And the challenges that we face, even based on the model of a military national security model, can't be met purely by military power. That's why NATO is now talking about the importance of human security. So there's a set of threats that when we created the system that we live in, technology and science and social organization had not stimulated. We could not melt the polar ice cap in the 17th century. 100 years ago, we couldn't melt the polar ice cap. We're melting the polar ice cap now. In the last several decades, 28 trillion tons of ice has melted and is pouring into our oceans that could change the actual alkaline acidic balance of the oceans, putting our third lung, phytoplankton, which produces 60 to 70% of our oxygen, at risk. That means that if we destroy that third lung, that the people of China and the United States will all perish. So this is existential. We can't put it off. We have to protect the health of the oceans. We have to stop the climate dynamic. We now, since 2000, we've increased CO2 in the atmosphere by 12%, and we haven't had this much CO2 in the atmosphere in over 3.5 million years. So this is a dramatic change that the human endeavor of how we heat our homes and move our bodies around is impacting the very evolutionary process. We're destroying species at 1,000 to 10,000 times. 1,000 is the lowest number. Many scientists say it's far higher, faster than the evolutionary base rate. We know that since 1970, 60% of the mammals, fish, birds, and reptiles on the planet have been destroyed. These are not issues that can be put off any longer. The United Nations Program for Development recently issued a report called Threats to Human Security in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene being the period we're in now, where the human endeavor is impacting the very life systems of the planet. So human security is a paradigm that starts with the truth, the reality that we have to cooperate to address the health and the regenerative processes of the natural world, the climate, the health of the oceans, rainforests, and as Ambassador Huntsman talked about, water, pandemics. Pandemics, as we know, don't carry passports. Pandemics seem to be smarter than our political leaders. I'm reminded of how foolish thinking can get when the arrogance of the focus on something we've created overtakes reason. And I'll just give a simple example. Our country, the United States, invaded Iraq, and our leaders said that when we got to Baghdad, the people would celebrate with flowers. Isn't it interesting that's essentially the same thing that Vladimir Putin told the Russian people about the invasion of Ukraine? That the people of Kiev would celebrate and throw flowers at the Russian soldiers? How wrong could our leaders be? How off common sense they could be, because I believe they're blinded by a way of thinking that's not appropriate to the reality that we face in the 21st century. As Albert Einstein said, the splitting of the atom has changed everything except our thinking, and we drift toward catastrophe. Nuclear weapons are a means of expression. They're not really things we can use. And they essentially say that we're not worried that they'll be used by accident, design, or madness, and that we can live in a perpetual state of threat and counter-threat. This is absolutely irresponsible. And it's also against the legal commitments that the United States and the other 8 other states in the world have, the legal commitment to negotiate their elimination. So China, to its credit, has a no first use policy. And President Biden, when he ran in the campaign for office, put forward a campaign strategy consistent with no first use. He said the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to prevent them from being used. That's a sole purpose. So I think one of the things that should be done immediately in the Ukraine is a no first use pledge. And the United States should lead in that. It was consistent with what the president ran for when he ran for office, and challenge Russia to step up. If Russia steps up, all the better. They then join India, China, the United States. And if we do it, our allies will balk at first. And we'll say, look, these weapons are just political. The weapons that we share, the 150 weapons we share with our NATO allies, they're not weapons to be used. They have no military value. We have more than enough to blow up the world numerous times without those weapons. It's a statement, and the statement should be, we want to lower the value of the weapons. And the other thing that we have to do is begin a process of negotiations with there's 9 states with nuclear weapons, and they have to come together and lay out a process that will lead to their elimination. But what do we have? Since 2000, the world has spent over $32 trillion. It's the level of expenditures and military expenditures is astronomical. And the United States has pledged well over $1.5 trillion to modernize our arsenal, stimulating an arms race. This is something that is going in the wrong direction. And I believe that as we start cooperating on addressing the threats that we share, as we cooperate in working together to protect our one frail, fragile planet, the absurdity of spending so much money in designing ways to annihilate the future will be loud and clear, and it will pave the way for a better world. Otherwise, the institutionalization of adversity that these weapons represent will continue to be a hurdle to achieving the cooperation that we need. And that's why meetings such as we've seen and statements such as the G20 have put forward, that nuclear weapons use or threat is inadmissible. This is a big breakthrough, I believe, and we need to, as citizens, we need to push our leaders to live up to it. And as President Biden said years ago, don't tell me your values, show me your budget. We need to be putting money into protecting the climate and less money into institutionalizing and threatening adversity. Having said that, we need to support the Ukrainian people. It's unacceptable what Russia did. It's illegal. It's dangerous. It's irresponsible. It can't be tolerated. But that doesn't need to be the framework for the future. That's the anomaly. The framework for the future is human security.
Thank you, Jonathan. And it would be great if we could all read the 17-page document that came out from the G20 summit. And so, Rorry, you have quite extensive experience leading and overseeing strategy and operations for projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. And your most recent research project audited the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue to evaluate its processes and outcomes. And the report of September 2021 indicates that even though the U.S. foreign policy in China projects its newfound power in a more aggressive way, there was a lot of benefit gained from an engagement process that really helped to stabilize the international financial system, address the then Ebola crisis, the Paris Agreement, nuclear safety cooperation, and a very clear appreciation of what diplomacy with China actually delivered, which appeared very positive. So, but the political economic systems of both countries are quite different. So President Xi has consolidated his power in a communist party and has a Marxist socialist system. And the US has a democracy and is capitalist. Now, I want you to please address first whether it matters that the two most powerful countries in the world operate out of two very different political economic systems. And second, notwithstanding that fact, please share what are the best ways forward to bring about greater certainty for cooperation on the nuclear issue, the climate aspect, and in your experience, where are the most effective issues where cooperation can take place? You now have the floor. Thank you, Rorry.
No, thank you very much. Thank you so much for reading that report carefully, and also for your questions. So you asked if it matters that the U.S. and China operate on two different political and economic systems, and yes, I think it matters a great deal. At their core, notwithstanding the excellent points that Jonathan made about, the nation state and how we organize ourselves in the international system, the policy making apparatus of both countries are big, complicated, messy bureaucracies. And so being able to fit them together in ways that are productive is actually quite a task. At the beginning of the engagement process, the strategic and economic dialogue that I've studied quite extensively and spoken to many of the principals who are in the meetings from top down, one key aspect that stood out to me is that at the beginning of the process, the two sides weren't even clear where the areas of bureaucratic interest overlapped or bureaucratic responsibility overlapped. Who, for example, is the counterpart on conservation issues if you don't have equivalent ministries on each side? Who should be taking a phone call about potential satellite collisions in space? These were connections that we just simply didn't have between the two countries because no one had invested the time and the effort into finding out how these two systems could possibly fit together. So that is one thing that the process that John Huntsman described, which was too top heavy and it was not results oriented, actually did bring some value to, which is identifying the interlocutor on the other side for which you could pick up the phone and call if you had an issue. And what was found, I think, in my research and through this process of engagement was that because those areas of operational responsibility did not overlap perfectly, when you did have a relationship, a U.S. official had a relationship with someone on the other side, they can actually build a fairly effective strategy towards solving issues outside of their own area of responsibility by looking at, knowing what the priorities were in the U.S. government and saying, oh, it's my interlocutor that has that issue in China, so I can go to him and get this question about human rights answered. I can get this question about environmental sciences cooperation answered. And so mapping those connections and bridging them was an incredible value of what was also, a big process. And I think that gets lost in the noise. Some of the very specific areas of bright spots in the relationship, issues that were handled well and had, I think, positive results for not just the bilateral relationship, but for the world as a whole, were some that you mentioned. And I'd love to go into just a tiny bit more detail on them. So first, the issue of climate change. Again, as a process, what the strategic and economic dialogue did was bring together a working group on climate change. As John Huntsman said, diplomacy is a people's game. And what I learned through my research was that the driving force behind that working group on climate change made it one of the most effective areas in the bilateral relationship by regularly releasing reports on its progress to track exactly what the commitments were that were being made in private discussions, to bring them into the wider conversation within the respective bureaucracies, and to hold each side to the commitments made. So the Climate Change Working Group, which has now been restarted under John Kerry and Xie Jianhua, is a process that can work quite well if it's managed well at the lower level of officials. Another area of bright spot that you mentioned was nuclear non-proliferation and cooperation. I want to make 2 points on this before I have to close my comments here. One is that the U.S. and China cooperated for many, many years on very sensitive issues of dual-use technology and nuclear weapons. Technology that can be used for civilian nuclear purposes could also be used for military nuclear purposes. And what they found through scientific cooperation with each other is that we could enhance the world's ability to turn highly enriched uranium, which is weapons grade fissile material, into low enriched uranium, which cannot be used to make a nuclear weapon. And not only did the US and China cooperate on this issue to turn some of China's nuclear plants from producing waste that was highly enriched to producing waste that was low enriched, they also then collaborated together to do the same thing at nuclear plants in Africa. So I think that ability of the two sides to find a way past their mutual suspicion on the military side to work on a nuclear issue and then to turn around and take that public good out into the world to reduce the stockpile of fissile material is a serious benefit of this greater push towards engagement and collaboration. The second and perhaps the final point I'll make on the nuclear issue is that I think that this commitment that that the U.S. and China made at the bilateral summit in Bali, that the use of nuclear weapons was unacceptable under any circumstances, is actually not just significant in terms of bilateral strategic stability, and not just significant in terms of Russia's, threats against Ukraine, but it's also significant to the overall strategic landscape in Asia. North Korea, the DPRK, has launched several missiles, a barrage of missiles, I think over 20 in the last few weeks. North Korea has been signaling that it would like to conduct a seventh nuclear test. And I think that the US wants to be sure that China is on the record saying nuclear weapons must not be used. And perhaps not only about Ukraine and about bilateral strategic stability, but also about this emerging threat from North Korea that really wants to use nuclear blackmail in order to get concessions in the international system that would be favorable to its economic and political development. Dealing with the North Korean nuclear situation and with the breakage of its commitments to the nuclear non-proliferation regime will have a positive effect on security posture throughout all of Asia. The alternative, and I think that China is aware of this, the alternative to dealing with North Korea's nuclear program and getting it somewhat under control is that South Korea is going to want to have nuclear weapons. Japan is going to want to have nuclear weapons. Other countries in the region are going to be looking at their nuclear posture and saying, how do I defend myself from nuclear blackmail from North Korea? So I really think that this commitment that was made, wonderful that it happened in the bilateral context, excellent that it happened at a time when the specter of nuclear war in Europe is rising, but also really, really significant for China and the US to make that commitment to nuclear non-proliferation and to strategic stability in Asia at a time when, notwithstanding all of these other crises, we were seeing a real drive towards nuclear armament among the countries of East and Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rorry. That was very, very informative for all of us who are especially concerned on the nuclear issue as well as the climate issue. But, having the information, how the points raised by you, we can actually find common ground. So the G20 summit in Indonesia, which just concluded, yielded two very important outcomes, according to the United States. And one is the joint position that Russia must not use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and an expected resumption of talks on climate between American and Chinese negotiators, which is a boost for the COP27 Global Climate Conference in Egypt. And Biden reported that he stressed to President Xi that Beijing also has an obligation to temper North Korea's destabilizing missile and nuclear activity that has the Pacific region on edge, just as you explained, Rorry. So that the world's two most powerful leaders have not been addressing these issues together in recent months shows how the entire world really suffers when Washington and Beijing are as deeply estranged as they've been this past year. So these public statements from both sides, it's really important for us to be able to hear and also appear to indicate a basic foundation that each recognize the critical nature of their rivalry and both want to ensure that it doesn't boil over into war. So they are moving towards reopening more regular conversations. Like, for example, we do know that U.S. Secretary of State Blinken is now expected to visit China next year, and such exchanges have been suspended since House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August and really triggered quite a fierce Chinese protest and a vast military operation that was showing a growing capacity to cut off the self-governing island. So, Jonathan, a question from Kay in Honolulu. In recent years, China has built up its nuclear forces and modernized its missiles and nuclear submarine fleet, and is now the third largest nuclear weapon state after US and Russia, respectively, which are second and first. And there is a growing concern that China says that to engage in nuclear talks, the U.S. in good faith must reduce its nuclear arsenal, which is, as you have previously explained, much larger than China's. And Presidents Biden and Xi seem to agree that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. But how can we move past this? I mean, what are the steps in U.S.-China non-proliferation efforts? And share, in addition to what Rorry has already shared, and please share your recommendations for, creating a greater peace in preventing catastrophic conflict between the U.S. and China in the short and long term.
So let's get some facts on the table. In the crisis, in the Cuban Missile, out of the crucible of the Cuban Missile Crisis, emerged the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has every country in the world in it except for 4: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. And that treaty has laid out a methodology of lowering the risk of nuclear weapons. It's been very successful in stopping proliferation. But part of the core bargain is if countries renounce having the weapons, they will observe the fulfillment of the nuclear weapon states, the P5, the United States, China, France, the UK, and Russia, negotiating the elimination of the weapons. But negotiating the elimination is not something overnight. There's a process that they've agreed to, that they've already agreed to, Audrey. They've agreed in 1995 to the indefinite extension of the treaty. The treaty had within it a provision that after 25 years, it would be reviewed to either terminate or be extended for a period of time or indefinitely. The 182 countries without the weapons said, okay, we will extend it indefinitely, but we want to see progress on disarmament. So every 5 years, there's a review process, and commitments have been made by the nuclear weapon states to move in that direction of disarmament, such as a test ban treaty, such as negotiating a treaty to stop the production of any more nuclear weapons-capable materials, such as strengthening the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, such as supporting the START Treaty. And I'm pleased to say that it seems that there is some appetite for Russia and the United States to continue the START Treaty, which lowers the number of weapons. And let me highlight that from the time of when President Reagan and President Gorbachev met and said a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, we've reduced the arsenal by over 80%. So we were way up around 70,000. We're now down to less than 13,000. Let's get some facts. China has less than 500 nuclear weapons, and both Russia and the United States have more than 5,000 each. So there's a disproportionate understanding of what China is doing. But the real thing that's important is the posture of the weapons. Because the weapons are used every day when they're online and on the ready to be used. And one of the things that's happened in recent time is the United States, which helped create the web of restraints on these weapons through the arms control process. We walked away from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Treaty. We walked out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which ensured mutual vulnerability. We walked out of the Open Skies Treaty. We have not lived up to our commitments that we made. Russia, for example, has ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, as has our allies France and the United Kingdom, but we haven't. So the first thing we have to do is realize how incredibly important it is to live up to the commitments that we make. There's a very fundamental concept in international relations and in the relations in marriages and in the relations in business. It's called pacta sunt servanda. It's a very, very foundation of civilized behavior, and it means promises must be kept. Promises made in the sobriety of negotiations, of treaties, have to be fulfilled. That's the first thing. And they can't be treated as as like some real estate negotiation that you can change at the settlement table. No, the relations between nations have to be treated with a level of solemnity and seriousness that they haven't been in recent years. The United States has a problem because of our invasion of Iraq, because of NATO's overreach in Libya, because of our 20 years in Afghanistan. This has caused much of the world to be very afraid of our integrity, and we have to look at the integrity of our commitments. On the other hand, let's look at China. It is a very different system, but they have pulled several 100 million people out of abject poverty in an incredibly fast amount of time, while the disparities of wealth in the United States have increased. So they feel some degree of pride over that. But they grossly violated their commitments with the freedom of Hong Kong. So there's levels of imperfections in both of our systems and in our state behavior. And it is the obligation of citizens to hold our political leaders to account, to live up to our promises. And the choice before us is very simple. We will either continue to, nuclear weapons are 1930s physics, 1940s technology. Science has not stood still. We have within our capacity to do more harm for less money and faster time than is being deployed. Nuclear weapons, we know what they do. They're only in the hands of 9 countries, and we know how to get rid of them. We know how to disassemble a weapon. We've done tens of thousands of them, and take the nuclear material and transform it into something that we can use to produce energy. We know how to do that. It's time that we change from the paradigm of mutual threats of destruction, to identifying our common interests in which nuclear weapons have no place. So the first thing is to live up to our commitments, have a no first use pledge, and then continue the process of ongoing dialogue. Just as Ambassador Huntsman said, it's really about, as Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell said in their famous manifesto, remember your humanity first. Remember your humanity, forget the rest.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And Rorry, though thankfully the U.S. and China have agreed to restart negotiations on the environmental crisis, we see previous agreements between the U.S. and China, which helped to pave the way for the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was the first global warming pact in which both developed and developing countries reached agreement on global warming. But how will this seemingly renewed cooperation between the U.S. and China translate into concrete agreements at COP27, which is still ongoing, since it seems the two countries are at odds on several fronts? For example, the U.S. wants negotiators to reaffirm a commitment to keep warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, but China seems to be insisting because that it would require China to commit to deeper emissions cuts And there is also the issue of creating a fund to help poor countries cope with the loss and damage from continuing climate disasters. And the US feels China should contribute to this new fund, given its large and growing contributions to global warming. But China wants to adhere to its status in the UN climate body as a developing country and not as an industrialized nation. So how can these differences be reconciled, one? And secondly, Rorry, we have a question on the Taiwan issue. Taiwan is home to more than 90% of the manufacturing capacity for the world's most advanced semiconductors and has the world's largest and most critical chip manufacturer with its products an integral part, as John Huntsman indicated, of everything from consumer products to military aircraft. But just 10% of its revenue comes from China, and more than half of its revenue comes from the US. To what extent, if any, is Taiwan's huge success and dominance as a vital chip manufacturer playing a large role in the accelerating political tensions over Taiwan that we see between China and the US?
Wow, that is an excellent question. I could give you an hour-long lecture on it. So let me think for just a second while I answer your other question about climate change, about how to wrap that up quickly. So yes, I'd like to underscore, if I could, Jonathan's comment about levels of imperfection. As he said that, I was thinking about my own marriage and how, where I might not see my own levels of imperfection, I could certainly point out all of those of my husband, and ditto the other way around. And I think the US and China are in a self-reflection deficit as well when it comes to climate change. So my suggestion to the envoys who are really just getting restarted again, and it may take a while to get to some deliverables, is to stop quibbling about the targets and start thinking about making action on climate change, not a basis of state responsibility, because we could play the blame game all day on how we got to where we are, but really is an imperative for all the reasons that Jonathan mentioned, for ourselves and for the rest of the world. So flipping that conversation from responsibility, loss and damage, all very important topics, they must be dealt with, to what are we going to do for our own goods and for the collective good of the world to forestall the worst case scenario. That would be my advice to them. And again, I think that, when push comes to shove, the US and China have pushed each other in positive directions on climate change policy. And we have an administration in the US, at least right now, that is very focused on pushing in a positive direction. So I do think that the next year or two looks bright for creating new commitments and holding each other to it, regardless of whether, they're perfect. Let's not make perfect the enemy of as good as we can get, because we have to build ambitious momentum and it has to start somewhere. On Taiwan and semiconductor manufacturing, I think that Taiwan's place in the global semiconductor supply chain is a factor in one factor of many in how the US sees its interest in a free, open, transparent, and self-governing, at the moment, Taiwan. So, but I stress that while TSMC might, only make 10% of its revenue in China, it has huge manufacturing plants in the PRC, as well as, as John Huntsman had pointed out, some nascent attempts to build fabs in the United States. So, the supply chain for semiconductors is pretty complex, and it's pretty distributed. Honestly, the changes that the Biden administration is trying to make with the CHIPS Act are going to cause huge disruptions in the global semiconductor supply chain industry. As to whether or not it's a primary motivating factor in tensions over Taiwan, I do not think so. I think the primary motivating factor in tensions over Taiwan is really a mismatch of US and Chinese interests over the future and fate of Taiwan. And that is to say that the Chinese government in Beijing believes that Taiwan is always been a part of China, and that that its separation is only temporarily tolerable, whereas the U.S. has seen, as John Huntsman pointed out, Taiwan's democracy grow and flourish, and has a deep stake and interest in making sure that Taiwan's political system is preserved. On top of that, of course, there's some geostrategic interest as well about how the PRC military could operate and act if it were to take over Taiwan. But none of these are really about semiconductor supply chains. It's about the politics. It's about the nationalism. It's about the ideology. And the tech issues, I think, have cropped up secondarily to these other issues. So a question that I get asked a lot in the United States is the fact of Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing, its core headquarters in Taiwan, either a motivating factor for Beijing to use military force to take over Taiwan, or a demotivating factor? It would not want to destroy this really important source of global semiconductor manufacturing. And I would say it's really neither. Beijing's plans to unify with Taiwan, of Beijing's plans to unify with Taiwan, the use of force is pretty far down the list of its ideal outcomes. So it would much prefer to resolve this through political dialogue. Peaceful reunification has been reiterated by Xi Jinping in his most recent work report as the method for which he would like to resolve the Taiwan issue. And Joe Biden himself came out and said that he did not think that an invasion of Taiwan from Beijing was an imminent threat. So, but this is a real area of difference in the bilateral relationship, and it's one of growing concern. One way that semiconductors and trade has affected U.S.-China relations over Taiwan and really soured, I think, things is that a lot of trade interest, investment interest, comes from congressional policy and members of Congress in the United States. So we've seen a huge push for members of Congress to visit Taiwan. I think that the members of Congress who are interested in semiconductor manufacturing, not only as a supply chain issue, but also as an engine of kind of American innovation and the American economic ecosystem, their visits to Taiwan, their support of Taiwan, which may start in ways from an economic basis, has definitely soured the atmosphere in U.S.-Taiwan relations, in U.S.-China relations. The issue at stake is, what is the nature of the U.S.'s unofficial relationship with Taiwan? And the relationship looks increasingly more official the more times that elected officials from the United States visit Taiwan. So this is an issue where I think we have to put it squarely in the basket of issues that we cannot resolve. The U.S. has its position on Taiwan. It's closely aligned with our own, the incentives inside our own political system. It's closely aligned with our own ideology. And it's very difficult to penetrate or change that in any way that would be beneficial to U.S. interests overall. China has its own view. China has its own ideology. It has its own political incentives. It has its own nationalism about Taiwan that's going to be very difficult to change in the near term. What we need to do is get back to what Deng Xiaoping always said, which is like, let's leave this problem for future generations. We're not wise enough to solve it. Maybe apocryphal, but nonetheless, that's how he's quoted as talking about Taiwan. And I think that this is probably the number one top issue for Beijing and the US to manage responsibly, is how we talk about Taiwan and what we do with our respective Taiwan policies. It's certainly the area where we are most likely to devolve into an accident or unintended conflict. As we saw after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, China simulated a military blockade. So this is an area where we really need to tread lightly. It's another area where I don't think either side needs to or should give up its primary interests about Taiwan in order to keep it manageable. It's an issue we've actually managed fairly well over the past 40 or 50 years. And the key moving forward will be to maintain open channels of dialogue about it and to really get out of this action reaction cycle and start talking in bigger picture. What are the principles that we can use to avoid conflict over Taiwan? And ultimately, if I can just, with my last remaining seconds, say the biggest factor in this entire relationship and downward spiral over Taiwan is that Beijing and Taipei are not talking to each other. When Beijing and Taipei are not talking to each other, the US role, because it has a relationship with Taipei, because it has a relationship with Beijing, takes on an outsized importance. So if I could humbly give the leaders in Beijing one recommendation, it would be to find a way back to direct dialogue with Taipei, not to cut the US out of the picture, but just because without that channel, the role of the US becomes so much more outsized in the strategic triangle.
Thank you so much, Rorry and Jonathan. And I wanted to give you, opportunity to have conclusory remarks, but we are out of time. And so I just wanted to do a very quick wrap up here in thanking you both for joining us and the very important messages that you have additionally given to our audience, additional to what John Huntsman had indicated, what our leaders, Xi and Biden have indicated. And I bring back what Gorbachev and George Shultz had indicated, that trust is the currency of diplomacy, and not only in diplomacy, but in marriage, and the aspect of self-reflection, as you indicated, Rorry, and the relationships between states, people, and each other. We have to also honor our commitments, as Jonathan, you indicated, and to keep our word, because that all goes to building trust. And without trust, you cannot have intimacy, and therefore people-to-people engagement will only be on the surface and not very deep and meaningful. So, I really want to thank so much Jonathan and Rorry for their participation in this Chinatown Hall, and the sponsors and co-sponsors of this event, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Global Security Institute, the Living Earth Movement, and the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, and to all of our viewers who have tuned in tonight. And may we all be blessed to have peace in our hearts and to be instruments of peace every day that we live. And we thank you all for joining us this evening, and we bid you all a very good night. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.